And just to give you an example, Kevin, I was reading recently about C.S. Lewis's childhood, and in his childhood, he really was drawn into Richard Wagner's music and his operas. He was really drawn into actually the mythology that was connected to a lot of Richard Wagner's music, and it was part of his descent into atheism and pessimism. And one might argue and say, well, you could just take the instrumental music of Wagner, and you might not have to be drawn into that. It's theoretically possible, but for him, it really did draw him in and contributed to his mood. It contributed to his demeanor. It was a rather formative part of the way he viewed culture. And thankfully, he came out of that and was able to view it later on as something quite negative in his childhood.
Welcome, my friends, to the Generations broadcast. Kevin Swanson with you today, along with me, Joshua Shwiso, who will be sharing with us on this segment of What Does the Bible Say About That? And we believe, Josh, that the Bible has something to share about everything and speaks authoritatively to all issues of life, and we can use the Word of God to direct us in faith and life, and to equip the man and the woman of God to every good work. So we have great confidence in God's Word to that end.
Absolutely, yeah. We know that the Bible's either going to give us big picture principles, it always gives us those in general, and then sometimes has very specific teaching on certain topics that gives us even further instruction.
And we did a segment on secular music just, I think, last week or the week before. And Phil came back and asked the question, hey, thanks for the Generations podcast on secular music. I've been enjoying your podcast, but it did make me wonder if you deal with some of the gorgeous classical music that was produced by God haters like Beethoven, Debussy, Richard Wagner, etc. While I thank God for the common grace that helps to produce things like that, I sometimes have mixed feelings about enjoying music that flowed from such wicked hearts. Let me know if you plan to do a follow-up podcast on that. Thanks. And this is probably one of the most difficult and complex questions there is, but something I believe that we as Christians should really be able to engage. Now, there is, as Phil mentioned in this letter to the broadcast, the issue of common grace. And that is the way I have put it in my book, Apostate, the Men Who Destroyed the Christian West, and to some extent, Epoch, the Rise and Fall of the West, is that there is both what I would call baseline and trajectory in terms of analyzing the literature and the art that comes out of the great thinkers and the great artists of our generation or previous generations. And so when I say baseline and trajectory, what I'm talking about is that everybody has some background in either common grace, or I guess what I would say a common grace that has worked its way through Christian history over a period of 1,800 years. So that I would refer to as common grace. That, you read Shakespeare, you realize he's got 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 references to the King James Version Bible, for example. And yet, at the same time, he tends to revert back into a pagan metaphysic. He seems to be, moving more towards fatalism, especially with I would say, The Tempest and Macbeth. So we have with Shakespeare and some of the great artists and literature giants of our generation and previous generations, we have both a baseline that is a Christian a biblical worldview base from which they're operating, but there's also a trajectory in which their heart is moving in a certain direction, and I would say we take both into consideration. And when you move into the post-Christian age or the anti-Christian age or the apostate Christian age of the 1800s and 1900s, I think you're moving into an arena that is even more dangerous than what I would call the pre-Christian age. So if you're comparing the literature, the artwork, et cetera, of the pre-Christians to those that are, moving back towards the vomit, I would say that according to Second Peter chapter 2 and Jude and a few other references, it is actually a worse case when somebody is turning away from the truth than the person who has never had access to the truth in the first place. So the apostate, and that's one reason why my book, Apostate, the Men Who Destroyed the Christian West, is really shaking things up a bit in the Christian literature world, because I'm just throwing a flag on the play and saying, the post-Christian apostates of the 19th century were absolutely worst case scenario. These are the people that are turning away from God. They are anti-Christ and anti-Christian in their outlook, and yet still hanging on to some remnants of the faith. I use the example of Nathaniel Hawthorne, who starts out with his favorite book is Pilgrim's Progress. He writes The Celestial Railroad, but before you know it, he's into the Scarlet Letter, and by the end of his life, he's into full-blown nihilism. So the trajectory of his life and his artwork, his literature, is absolutely horrendous, and yet he's working off of the beginnings of a Christian worldview and the common grace that is associated with that. So I spent more time in the literary giants with books like Apostate, The Men Who Destroyed the Christian West, than I have with music. But I think the same principle applies, Josh.
Yeah, and I was thinking, Kevin, about how as the apostasy deepens, you have less and less common grace evident in the music. So if you take Beethoven, for example, you're dealing with a lot more Christian culture that he's coming out of, so you have a lot more harmony, a lot more beauty, whatever its imperfections. Compare that to Eminem's rap music of the 2000s, and you have a dramatic contrast in terms of how much common grace is evident in the music.
Because there's not much memory foam left.
There's not much left.
The memory is just about gone.
Pretty much completely
You're looking at
gone.
200 years of almost nonstop work at purging any kind of remnants of a Christian worldview out of the system.
And that's why we sometimes think, well, I'd much prefer listening to Beethoven over Eminem for a variety of reasons, right? Even though we got to deal with this question, should we listen to Beethoven or should we listen to Claude Debussy, or how should we think about their music?
So go through some biblical background on common grace, because God has retained for us by his common grace some good things, even amongst those who are not Christians.
Yeah, well, in a broadest sense, we kind of think about common grace in terms of God's goodness to the world despite its sinfulness. So Jesus gives this principle in Matthew 5 that he makes his rain to fall on the just and the unjust. So that's God's goodness. Psalm 145 says that Lord is good to all, and his tender mercies are over all his works. So that's terms of God's goodness. And then in addition to that, we could say that mankind is still made in the image of God, and yet because of the fall into sin, the knowledge, righteousness, and holiness we ought to have is marred. It's damaged and twisted by the reality of sin, and yet it still comes through in terms of unbelievers showing some measure of goodness. And the more God gives grace, the more he restrains evil in a society, the more you see of that goodness, truth, and beauty in the lives of unbelievers and in culture in general.
And the Christian worldview retained strongly into all of Western culture, music, and art well into the 1600s, on into the 1700s with Bach and Handel and others. Now, as you move into the 1700s, on into the 18th century, Franz Joseph Haydn, Amadeus Mozart, who died in 1791, both of these are Catholics. Haydn was more humble, more prolific, lived longer. Like Bach, he signed off his scores with Sola Deo Gloria, or Nomini Jesu. His famous oratoria, The Creation, was written in the purpose to glorify and to adore and to worship the Creator. Meantime, Mozart was, crossing lines. He was trying to address some of the rising demand for sexual intrigue amongst his operas. Mendelssohn continues on with the Christian Trinitarian worldview big time. He was, by the way, a converted Jew, but sometimes seen as Bach Jr. He would say the essence of art is unity in variety. That is, he saw this to be the soul of his art, very much a Trinitarian. So he understood that beauty was reflected not in chaos, not in a strict Unitarian view of things, which is very boring, but in a very complex intermix of the unity and the complexity, or the variety, as he would put it. And then Beethoven shows up in the early 19th century. So he's there in the 1820s, 1830s. And Beethoven marks the crossover into humanism and romanticism. His creedal statement was under the glass top of his desk, right there at all times. And this was his operational worldview. This is what he said: I am that which is. I am that which is. I'm the essence of what is of essence. I am all that is, and that ever was, and that will ever be.
Wow.
No mortal man has lifted my veil. He is of himself alone. That is, mortal man is of himself alone. And it is to this aloneness that all things owe their being. So he's very much a humanist, godless, atheistic, et cetera, et cetera. And Wagner, of course, took that to an extreme. So you begin to see this working out of a full-fledged romanticism and humanism in the 19th century. Now, here's one other point that I want to make. I think we can say this, that culture is worldview externalized. That is, a person's basic construct, his worldview, his view of reality, his view of himself, his view of God, his view of purpose, meaning, et cetera, is reflected in his art and literature. And thus, I think we ought to be more interested in a person's worldview than culture, because to understand his culture, you have to understand something of his worldview. Now, you take a musician, might say something like, I believe in chaos. I believe in chaos. Or an artist might say, I believe in chaos. And so he creates, I believe that there is no ultimate order in the universe, that there is no ultimate oneness in creation or in God. Okay. And so he would say, well, let me create some beautiful art. So he works at this pretty hard, I believe in chaos. Now, you can see here, maybe describe it for our radio listeners. Yeah. Here is the beauty of the art created by one who believes in chaos.
Lines and dots randomly.
Objectively, is that beauty? Now, of course, many will say, no, beauty is entirely subjective. But we would say, no, that's not beauty. But that's because it is chaos, and there is no unity drawing together the particulars in this artistic presentation. So again, there is something objectively good or objectively bad, objectively beautiful or objectively ugly about an artistic presentation, whether that be in music or art. And you would agree with that?
Absolutely, because God is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty. He's even described as beautiful in the scriptures, of course, not physically appearing so, but in terms of what comeliness really means. And so likewise, anything we produce needs to actually reflect his character in some way or another.
Now, here's another principle that I believe we need to draw into this, because you asked me off air, you said, well, we have to bring Scripture to bear here, so let's be sure we do this. So how can we determine one particular art form to be wrong, to be unhealthy, to be unedifying, something that I should not participate in? And I think one of the key answers to that is to understand art for what it is, that art is symbolic. Art is symbol. Music is symbol. Art, therefore, ties into the principle we find throughout the New Testament relating to food offered to idols. We find that in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 Corinthians 8, and a few other passages throughout the New Testament.
Yes.
So this, I think, is the answer to it. Now, Ken Myers, in his book, All of God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes, brought out the point about music, that music has a connectivity to other social and cultural parts of human existence, and that music is created contextually in a context. And we experience one thing connected with another thing. In other words, one thing reminds us of something else. We for example, might be listening to some music which really aligns our own thinking with a one-night stands, or with a isolated cultural conditions that are not taking place within a covenantal life of family and church.
Yes.
Another Saturday night, I ain't got nobody. Et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea that the guy is kind of this loner living in the apartment, and all he can do is pick up somebody on a Saturday night because he ain't got nobody. So there's always this connection of one thing to another in music. It could be an individual experience, individually connecting one thing to another, or it could be a community experience in which we all relate to what is being symbolized within a community. And I've given this example before of a Playboy symbol on a T-shirt. If I was to get up in front of a church and preach a sermon with my T-shirt and the symbol of the Playboy bunny on my T-shirt, within our community, we associate the symbol of this rabbit with the idea of promiscuity or sexual sin that is apparently permissible in our given context. And so it would be hard for anybody to take me seriously because of the connection that's going on in the home.
We
in the
think
mind.
you're endorsing sexual sin in some way.
Right.
You're promoting something that you ought
Right.
not to promote.
There appears to be an implicit or maybe even an explicit approval of the thing that is being symbolized, and that is sexual promiscuity. So that would be one reason why I would not preach with a Playboy symbol on my t-shirt. The music is the same way. Music operates the same way. I think I've given this illustration before, but a youth pastor goes to some secular concert in which there's all of this music and all of these forms being expressed in this context. Where there's no fear of God, where there's this obnoxiousness, where there's no real respect for the seventh commandment, etc. You follow me there? That sort of thing happens in secular concerts, as I understand it. And I'm not sure I've ever been, maybe one secular concert, and I will say, yeah, there's a fair amount of that. And so he comes into his youth group and he says, well, here's what they were doing. They were all lifting the middle finger. It was a symbol. Now, nothing wrong with the middle finger, but they were all lifting the middle finger and screaming at the top of their lungs. Now, that's what we want to bring into the worship today. Okay, now, I think pretty much every listener would say, well, that's just horrible. That's wretched.
Totally
that's
inappropriate
obnoxious.
Symbol. Yeah.
We would never do anything like that because we have an association of these musical forms and these musical attitudes and perspectives and hand gestures that are being expressed in a secular concert. We all know what it means.
Yes.
And to bring that into a worship service would be blasphemous. And I think most people understand these sorts of things. Now, the point is that we need to be honest about the music that we're listening to. If we live in a traditional culture and suddenly revolutionary forms show up, then we all recognize the forms to be revolutionary. And therefore, to participate in the revolution becomes counter to God's will for us. And that's the way Christians would have viewed Beethoven, say, in the 1820s. The question remains, though, to what degree are we all recognizing the traditions versus the revolution? So, again, it depends a great deal upon how we identify with these things. And that's why Paul said, you're not to eat the food offered to idols if it gives the people around you the impression that you're approving of the thing that thing was supposed to have symbolized. And if you yourself are associating it with that evil idolatry that was symbolized in the food that was offered to idols, then you need to avoid using
Right. You're going to violate your conscience. And then, of course, you could potentially participate in idolatry, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10 as well.
Yeah. So in some sense, cultural forms are relativistic to whether or not we are making the identification concerning the things that are being symbolized to the thing that are, the sinful thing or the ideological thing that is false and wicked and wrong. And if there's that identification going on in my mind or in the minds of the people around me, then I'm going to have to forbear the use of those forms.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just to give you an example, Kevin, I was reading recently about C.S. Lewis's childhood. And in his childhood, he really was drawn into Richard Wagner's music and his operas. He was really drawn into actually the mythology that was connected to a lot of Richard Wagner's music. And it was part of his descent into atheism and pessimism. And one might argue and say, well, you could just take the instrumental music of Wagner and you might not have to be drawn into that. It's theoretically possible. But for him, it really did draw him in and contributed to his mood. It contributed to his demeanor. It was a rather formative part of the way he viewed culture. And thankfully, he came out of that and was able to view it later on as something quite negative in his childhood. But I thought that was a noteworthy example of how a young man can be affected by music that in the modern day would be viewed as something of like almost classical music or part of that broader classical tradition. And it's not all neutral. We do need to be thoughtful about it.
Yeah, and it's, again, food offered to idols. And yet we need to be serious and sincere and thoughtful and honest about whether or not we are making the identification between the thing, the symbol itself, and that which the symbol is symbolizing. And certainly, if the creator of this art form is specifically saying, "I believe in chaos. Mm-hmm. This is my worldview," then we should take that seriously, mm-hmm. because he is doing his best to convey a particular worldview through his art form.
Yeah, and I think of like John Cage in the 20th century, that composer that Schaeffer would talk about, and it's almost ridiculous to call him a composer because some of his compositions, quote unquote, involve sitting at the piano for a period of time and then closing and then walking away, and that was the musical piece. And it actually became so absurd that, few people really had any interest in it. But at least he was being consistent with his worldview of chaos and nonsensical art. Sometimes, though, it's more subtle because there's a degree of seeming beauty and order mixed in with chaos. I think Wagner is actually something of an example of that, where there's a degree of order and unity, but then a total loss of that in other cases.
And so what do we do? How do we, move on this? I think the answer is that we should, first of all, prefer Christians and those artists that present a right worldview and have thoughtfully and considerately presented that worldview in cultural expressions. Mm-hmm. And we find that in Johann Sebastian Bach. We see that in Mendelssohn. We see that somewhat in Haydn, a little bit in Mozart. Mm-hmm. And I think being able to siphon through it a bit is important. Mm-hmm. But there's actually just a number of things to consider. The first thing to consider is the motivation or the heart or the worldview of the artist himself. So to understand that is helpful. Secondly, to understand what this art form is doing for you. Mm-hmm. Is it yielding more worship, the fear of God, et cetera? Now, the two principles that I think tie into culture more than anything else, biblical principles that tie into culture, are the worship of the true and living God, glorifying God, enjoying Him forever, responding in thanksgiving to His good gifts, and not so much the glory of man, but the glory of God. Mm-hmm. And also the fear of God, the reverence of God, thanksgiving to God and praise to God. That's number one. Is this music form, is this art form encouraging you to lift your hands in worship and thanksgiving for the true and living God? We brought that out last time. Yeah. But secondly, I do believe that the fifth commandment is a cultural commandment. Mm-hmm. One of the ways in which you break down culture is by so revolting against the previous generation that multiple generations cannot participate in the music. Mm-hmm. And that, my friends, is extremely damaging, because the fifth commandment is the cultural commandment. In other words, we want things to go well with us in the earth. Honor your father and your mother, that things may go well with you on the earth. And so you take, somebody like Eminem, you ask yourself, he has references to his mother, references to parents that are some of the most egregious and horrendous references
the kind
we've
of
ever read in all of history.
Capital crimes
kind of stuff in the Old Testament, right? And so how do you get from Bach to Eminem? And I believe the way you do this is by successive generations that have dishonored the art forms and the cultural forms of their mothers and fathers over a number of generations. Mm-hmm. So that's how you break down a culture. You put a culture back together by participating in the same cultural forms together, and honoring your father and your mother's standards of culture. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't build off of them.
Yeah,
you certainly
more.
Can, but you're standing on their shoulders. You're not revolting against them. So evil forms of culture, negative forms of culture, destructive forms of culture develop when successive generations are revolting against their parents and grandparents in their cultural forms. And things will not go well with them in their culture. Mm-hmm. Things will not go well with them in their lives. And things will not go well with them in their nation, their civilizations, or their respective church or whatever it may be. So I believe the breakdown of culture happens with the systemic violation of the fifth commandment, the commitment to dishonor mothers and fathers from one generation to the next.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Kevin, do you think that classical music in general is superior to modern music? If you're going to like direct somebody to say, hey, should we go listen to classical music? We need to actually cultivate a love for this. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that in general, folk music tends to honor one's own parents and grandparents. You think of the country song, That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine, or something like that. My grandfather's clock was too large for the shelf, so it stood 90 years on the floor. Typically, folk music honors parents and grandparents. They do so in the lyrics, and they do so in terms of the forms. And then that's how folk music develops. High art, I believe, develops by successive generations, not just 3 or 4 generations, but typically 8, 9, 10 generations of musicians building off of the musical contributions of previous generations. That's how you get to Bach. Bach is working off of 7 to 8 generations of Bachs who have gone before them throughout the German Christian experience. And so yes, I think in many cases, not so much the revolutionary forms, but in many cases, classical music is a high art form in which we have seen successive generations, many generations, honor previous generations in their art forms. And so I believe we have what I would say is a high art form that we can, as Christians, enjoy, and there's folk art forms we can enjoy as well. But it's pop art that tends to be a form of art that really honors nobody but fame. But immediate, quick fame in which you get an exciting piece of music that's you can call it music. It may or may not be music, but that is receiving some adulation from a young crowd, and then within about 6 months or 3 years or 6 years, it's of no use whatsoever. So
it tends to not last very long, but it's also flowing out of revolution and rebellion in most cases, right?
That's right. So, and I borrow much of that from Ken Meyer's book, All of God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes. Very thoughtful book, but he didn't really quite put in the 5th commandment. I added that myself in my book, The Tattooed Jesus. So if anybody would like a little bit more on some of these discussions on the rise and fall of culture in the Western world, certainly get a copy of Epoch, The Rise and Fall of the West. We've referred to some of that in this edition of the program. Also, The Tattooed Jesus and Apostate, the Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. All 3 of these have some interaction with these cultural forms and how Christians can interact with them, especially as we deal with 200 years of revolution in the Western world. Well, that wraps up this edition of the program, friends. If you'd like to interact at all with the program, please email us at mail@generations.org. This is Kevin Swanson and Joshua Suiso inviting you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation.
This has been a production of the Generations Media Network. For more information, go to generations.org/media.